Hi, Brittany. My name is Lily, and my thesis is called A Framework for Revolution, the Global Impact of Maoism. And if you can look at this photo I have here, it's a propaganda poster that depicts Mao as the artist of the Cultural Revolution. And it basically pretty much captures like this energy that Mao brought to the world as this like dynamic leader leading a socialist revolution, not only in China, but inspiring many movements across the world. So I am a student pursuing a dual degree in political science and BDIC, and I use she, her pronouns. And my interests are in navigating the intersections between racial justice, social activism, and Asian American studies, which is how I found myself doing this thesis, and really debunking Western perceptions of what this moment in history is, because I think Mao tends to be a controversial figure in the US, as we oftentimes misinterpret, one, his ideology, two, we have this like raging fear of socialism here in the US. So, thinking about all of that and just kind of really using my thesis as a way to debunk a lot of these perceptions that we have about this historical figure and his legacy. So this is a brief outline of my thesis that I will be going through today. I'm going to start my presentation by reading a quote from Robert Williams, who was a prominent Black activist in the 60s and who actually met Mao, which is really interesting, and to have taken a lot from Mao's thinking and there's the very interesting interconnections between these two historical figures. So this is he states, this is the era of Mao Zedong, the era of world revolution and the Afro-American struggle for liberation. As a part of an invincible movement worldwide, Chairman Mao was the first world leader to elevate our people's struggle to the fold of the world revolution, end quote. And if you look over here, you can see this really interesting newsletter that Robert Williams actually published, and he basically it really demonstrates like this interconnections between Mao and him, and just like the admiration he has for Mao's work. Introduction. China's rise in the 20th century contributed new ideas to globalization. Under Mao, they experimented with an adapted form of Marxist communism. Despite its contradictions, China developed an alternative way of modernity that has been replicated across the world and has been the basis of countless revolutionary efforts. Maoism fundamentally challenges the Euro-centric view of globalization and liberalization by pointing to the flaws of such systems in the ways that it leaves out the third world. And Mao defines the third world as any non-imperialist nation. So it's like very different from how white people defines the third world. Instead, in his three worlds theory, which I will talk a little bit more later in the presentation, he thinks about the third world as a space for unity and solidarity against imperialism. So the biggest question is, what does Mao offer to the world? Oftentimes in the West, we like to think that the East, and especially China and Mao, are these like really Orientalist figures, and they, are very backwards, right? But instead, how come we don't think of him as somebody who's like a pioneer who actually had something to offer to the world and did offer to the world? So China's rising would not be possible without Mao's vision and policies that allow China to modernize, bring people out of poverty, and catch up to the rest of the world. Maoism was the outcome of Mao Zedong seeing the turmoil in China after the fall of the Qing dynasty and the subsequent wars that left China needing to rebuild both structurally and ideologically. Mao Zedong's thought or Maoism had a lasting global legacy despite its contradictions. So the Cultural Revolution. So launched by Mao, the Cultural Revolution's goal was to purge capitalism from Chinese society and reform those who were deemed as counter-revolutionaries and re-educate them based on Mao Zedong thought. As such, to properly interpret the legacy of the Cultural Revolution, we must unpack the theoretical elements of Mao's experiment. The Chinese Revolution ties class struggle with issues of national independence from imperialism and development as various nations' economies were slowly becoming intertwined into a globalizing capitalist system that was ruled by the West. So the idea of cultural revolution was not supposed to be something that was just like supposed to just exist in China. Like ideally, what Mao had hoped was that people would be inspired by what was happening in China, which was this like purging of like capitalistic beliefs and ideas and individuals, and take that and replicate it. That was essentially what Mao had hoped for. Of course, not all of his visions were achieved. But I think it's like very important in talking about the Cultural Revolution to really think about like what was his exact intentions, because oftentimes, again, in the West, we like to think that this was like a, backwards experiment that like drastically failed. However, what is left out is that the Cultural Revolution actually like was a huge part, like a literary movement as well, where a lot of people became civically engaged and started reading and started, like Mao's Little Red Book, and theorizing and really thinking about how they can build China like up again and how can they like reimagine their society. And that was kind of, and hence, if you break down cultural and revolution, like it was supposed to be a culture revolution, like reforming, changing this like the very culture of their society. And this ties into Mao's three worlds theory. So this theory was about solidarity, fundamentally. It was about how do we take what the West thinks about, the quote unquote third world, and flip it on its head and gain power from that. So he essentially wanted to create like a third world resistant movements that aspire to decolonize and produce an alternative modernity. Essentially, the three worlds theory was about self-reliance, self-reliant development, and highlighting the importance of delinking national economies from global capitalism, which was very much like ruled and controlled by the West, right? Like, so what Mao really wanted was how do like the people of the global majority band together against Western imperialism and gain economic independence and freedom. So a really good quote that kind of captures Mao's impact on the third world or the global south is this one. The Maoist spin pertained primarily to issues of class struggle under the conditions of imperialism and the role of peasantry in the revolution. The struggle for revolution under semi-colonial, semi-feudal conditions changed the nature of class struggle from between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat to a people's war. So essentially this idea of people's war is that it's like all these people that are oppressed under imperialism, they all come together and they, fully dismantle imperialistic structures and rebuild. So that kind of connects with kind of my two case studies in this thesis. One is in India, and then the other is in the US. India was chosen because of its proximity to China and its really robust Maoist movement. And then I chose the US as essentially what we perceived as the antithesis to China and the place where, essentially all of these problems originate from, like the very understanding of like US imperialism like came from, right? And kind of seeing like how do the people in the US think about Maoism and how do they like interpret and apply Maoist thinking. So India. So the Communist Party of India spearheaded the Maoist movement. They're known as Indian Maoists or the Naxalites. And while they are frequently demonized, the Naxalites have continued to struggle against the capitalistic exploitation of India's poor. And really interesting aspect of this is like indigenous struggles too. Like the Naxalite movement pretty much was grounded upon how do we stop the Indian state, which was a capitalistic state, from fundamentally exploiting indigenous people, exploiting the poor. And this was due to like issues such as having their land taken away, exploitation of labor, like all of these things that fundamentally is like the hallmark of capitalism. Like the Naxalite, the individuals involved in the Naxalite movement fundamentally wanted to push India to be better, to become a socialist country that actually cares about its people. So these are kind of two very interesting examples of the impact that the Maoist movement in India had, and the very, very real achievements that the Naxalites had in India. Like oftentimes I think sometimes we think of communist movements and like socialist movements, and we forget that actual good come out of those, right? Like I think we tend to hyper focus on the violence and all of these things, but it's only through political power gained through the barrel of the gun, as Mao would say, do we get these really real achievements. So two things, land redistribution and labor rights. So the Naxalite movement, so these quotes were taken from two government documents, from the Indian state. They created a committee to kind of examine the complaints that people were having in the country, specifically around the way that the state was handling and not handling the concerns of the people. And even though the Indian state really pretty much criminalized Naxalites, they can't help but acknowledge the very real achievements that this movement had. For example, they said that the Naxalite movement was credited to helping the landless get land, and get land for farming, get land to build a home. And then in terms of labor rights, they attribute the Naxalite movement to helping to get people paid and not end the exploitation of indigenous labor. And they even kind of acknowledge that the government failed to address these things. And you can pretty much see this tension between the capitalistic government that will always prop up capitalism, and then the Naxalites as a socialist Maoist movement that are fundamentally attempting to redistribute wealth. So Maoism and Black solidarity in the US. Sometimes again, when we think of Maoism, we think of him as just simply in the context of China, in the context of Asia. We don't think about how his impact actually reaches to the very heart of empire, which is the US, right? And how he has touched liberation movements here in the US. And a very tangible example of that is his influence and impact on the Black liberation movement and building solidarity, international solidarity. So Maoism and the Black solidarity. Maoist thought in the Chinese Communist Party and movement impacted Black radicals in the 50s throughout the 70s. China provided Black radicals with a third world Marxist model that enabled them to challenge the Western vision of class struggle by applying a racial lens to it. Maoism offered a systemic analysis that connected the injustices of people of color that they faced domestically in the US with the injustices abroad. So this kind of connects with Robert Williams' theory of Black internationalism. He was the first Black person to bring to elevate Black struggle, not just as a domestic issue, but as a transnational, international issue, which it is, because as we can understand, with the issue of colonialism and imperialism, there was a global exploitation led by white people of the people of the global South, and and hence the third world liberation movement. So Maoism gave Black radicals this understanding of how do we liberate yourself, not only through a class struggle and a people's war, but as racialized people as well. So incorporating a racial justice lens to this work. And I think that's it made a difference that Mao was this Chinese man doing this work and not a white man thinking about communism. So another example is, so kind of diving deeper into Robert Williams. An interesting thing is that he was the one that wrote to Mao during the civil rights movement and basically asked him to call out the US for their racism. And as a result of Williams' urging, Mao released a statement supporting the American Negroes in their struggle against racial discrimination by US imperialism. So Mao explicitly tied race with imperialism, and this understanding that the US engages in like a racialized imperialism. And that was really big, like this idea of like globalizing racism, right? Like, and basically like pretty much like naming that as a thing driven by the West. And this is a really interesting quote from Mao's statement. So he states, an American Negro leader now taking refuge in Cuba, Mr. Robert Williams, the former president of Monroe, North Carolina, chapter of the NAACP, has twice this year asked me for a statement in support of American Negroes' struggle against racial discrimination. On behalf of the Chinese people, I wish to take this opportunity to express our resolute support for the American Negroes in their struggle against racial discrimination for freedom and equal rights. So yeah, it's this like interconnection of racial injustice and class, and this is like kind of him bringing these two things together, and that's kind of what like an important aspect of Maoism and their impact and its impact in specifically in the US context. So another example of this is the Black Panthers. So like Williams, Huey Newton, the founder of Black Panthers, took inspiration from Mao. He like read Mao during his time in college and, you know, attributed his like conversion to like socialism and like understanding the world through like Mao and his like in the Chinese Revolution. And this is very much documented in Newton's autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide. He talks extensively of how inspired he was by the Chinese Revolution and how he takes aspects of what Mao did and apply it to his work domestically in the US. So this is a quote. So this is a quote as he like went to China. So as we crossed into China, the border guards held up their automatic rifles as a signal of welcome. And then the Chinese truly live by the slogan, political power grows out of the barrel of gun. And their behavior constantly reminds you of that. For the first time, I did not feel threatened by a uniformed person because police brutality. Instead, like the soldiers were here to protect the citizenry. And then at every airport, thousands of people welcomed us, applauding, waving their little red books and carrying signs that read, "We support the Black Panther Party, down with US imperialism," or "We support the American people, but the Nixon imperialist regime must be overthrown." So again, this like revolutionary spirit of the Chinese people truly carried over to their critique of the US and this like intersection with the Black liberation movement. And Du Bois. So this photo is actually one that is held at UMass, which is very interesting in our archives. So prior to Williams and Newton, Du Bois actually himself traveled to China, and he was pretty much one of the first Black intellectuals that went to China and like paved the way for future Black intellectuals in their thinking of China and their understanding of like what solidarity between China and their struggle here as Black Americans can look like. So in conclusion, what Maoism offers the world was a way to resist the structures that reproduce neoliberal, imperialistic, and US-centric policies and conditions. Maoism gave power to individuals in movement that sought to challenge the social order. Through his theory and methods of revolution, he believed deeply that if you want to know the theory and methods of revolution, you must take part in revolution. All genuine knowledge originates in direct experience. Thank you, and happy to answer any questions.